This episode is brought to you in part by the Calliopeia Foundation and listeners like you. Calliopeia supports projects interweaving spirituality, culture, and ecology. We are grateful for their support and the support of grassroots contributions from listeners. To learn more about the Calliopeia Foundation, visit calliopeia.org. To make a donation to For the Wild, visit forthewild.world/donate or support us through Patreon. Welcome to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. On today's episode, I'm excited to be in conversation with the acclaimed author, ecological activist, artist, musician, and historian, Jesse Wolfe Hardin. Wolfe has been a leading voice of and for the natural world for over 4 decades, was the first to coin the term rewilding, and has been arrested and pepper sprayed as well as applauded for his actions.
If we have, in the moment, accepted our wildness, reclaimed our connection to, and empowered ourselves to act upon the world that we know to be enlivened and sacred. That's what all peoples have always known, and it is not just the way to do things, but it is the reward. It's a way that we can feel the passion, and that passion will drive us to many great successes.
Wolfe has been a featured presenter at hundreds of conferences and universities, and under the name Lone Wolf Circles, was the creator of cross-cultural eco-spiritual collaborations, appropriately called medicine shows, melding his powerful spoken word with live music, indigenous presentations, and focused activism. He is the author of over 800 published articles in over 200 different publications, as well as over 25 books. His work earning the praises of luminaries such as Gary Snyder, Joanna Macy, Ralph Metzner, Starhawk, and Rosemary Gladstar. Well, welcome to the show, Wolfe. It's so wonderful to have you here today with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Before we begin, I'd like to share that reading through your beautiful writing in preparation for this interview reactivated some of my oldest and deepest loves in herbalism and cultivating wild space and plant medicine. So I hope our listeners have a chance to dig into your vast body of work beyond what we're able to cover today.
Oh, wonderful.
So, Wolfe, a common thread that I've noticed runs through your writing is the spirited call to re-entangle ourselves in the places we call home, to fall in love, in knowledge, in relationship with the landforms and waters that flow around us. And in your book, The Healing Terrain, you often refer to place as bioregion, where you write, quote, terraform and life form interact to create patterns of relationship and community, end quote. And this term gets thrown around a lot. So to ground our conversation, I'd love to begin by orienting within and around the concept of bioregion. So if you could help animate this term beyond the colonial boundaried notion of place that we're so used to navigating, that would be wonderful. And maybe a second part to that question is, what comes alive when we orient our sense of place around the dynamic worlds of living ecology?
Bioregionalism was first introduced to me by Peter Berg, who's deceased now. And it was established as our recognition, really, that there's different parts of nature that have different personalities, different ecological systems that express themselves as in different voices and in different ways. And we noticed that you couldn't just have one singular policy or even one singular emotional or spiritual approach, because each area varied so much. So if we think in terms of the millions of years that humans and pre-humans have existed, all those processes of evolution, change, growth, awareness, to the degree that we're aware now, it is formed by particular areas, not by a general concept of the earth. Mother Earth is a beautiful image, but it fails us in many ways. We don't engage with a generic mother. What we do is recognize that we are a part of a visceral, spiritual, physical, ecological part of nature, which is manifest in specific areas in specific ways. And so, yes, we have a desert bioregion, many different desert bioregions. So it's not just ecotones and different ecosystems, but it's an actual personality of place. The second recognition for me at least, was that we are not just learning how to relate to and how to affect the environment in the particular places we live and connect to it deeper, but rather that it is the place which sculpts us. It takes us like a piece of clay and affects how we react emotionally, what our value systems are, what our aesthetics are, what we find most beautiful, what amazes us, what befuddles us, and where off the wonderment comes. And that's a very personalized process. The moment that you even look out the window in the largest metropolitan area, you suddenly see the larger picture. Go out to a park, that's even more so. Drive the 40, 60, 100 miles, whatever you have to get to a relatively wild place, and it even becomes more evident that these are not just settings, they're not stages for the human drama, but rather they are the point of interconnection in which we make an impact and it in turn makes an impact on us.
Yes, I do feel that impact. I feel so deeply how the land impacts us when we begin to open up to relationship. And I feel like that has been such a part of my own journey with Cougar Mountain and the forest, just letting the land impact us. I think as modern humans who have gotten so far from land relationship, land connection, it's almost like we've built barriers to allowing that kind of impact, because this modern dominant culture is really so much about us making the impact and us having the control. And so, yeah, I really am happy that you spoke to that. And moving deeper into this notion of bioregionalism, I'd like to read another short passage from The Healing Train. Quote, "Each bioregion is self-satisfied, creating and sustaining the factors and conditions for its fruition and fulfillment. It is this we might best cleave to in these troubled times. A distinctive community of life where little needs to be imported, nothing is alien or extra, and nothing is amiss," end quote. And oh my goodness, I just love the image of wholeness that you sculpt through your words. And it feels so healing to embody the shape of abundance and the thought that we all have what we need in a sense. And in this time of disconnection and severance, how does this touch our human soul to be called forth as active co-creators, stewards, and humble members of a larger biotic community? What is, as you call it, the geography of belonging?
I could probably best speak to that in terms of my own experience, which always seemed like I was coming to these realizations late, and perhaps because I was feeling it for an entire species, not just for myself. But when I first got to where I live, which is in the Gila Wilderness of Southwest New Mexico, it's not the deserts that are normally associated with the Southwest. It's a fairly rare and very high mountain range. It was the first place set aside as a protected wilderness area, in fact. And many thanks to Aldo Leopold, who made his transition from a scientific resource extraction approach to nature to truly embodying a deep ecological sensibility, and best expressed in his essay about the green fire dying in the wolf's eye after they killed it for the sake of deer. And that changed my life to hear that. And I came there, I have to say, originally looking for two things: sanctuary from the madness, the superficiality, the rancor and conflict, and basically just the buzz of technology that made me feel constantly amiss, constantly ill at ease. And so I found my sanctuary, and it wasn't very long before one thing after another showed that actually perhaps I was being brought there, being employed by the region in order to serve it and to meet its needs rather than just the other way around. And it began with realizing that just by chasing off the cattle that had grazed on our San Francisco River for over 100 years, and just to chase them off the property on a daily basis created enough new growth that they used photographs of the repaired canyon in order to win a lawsuit that guaranteed the huge section of the San Francisco and Gila rivers would be fenced off as corridors and protected from grazing. Seeing that I wasn't totally, and still am not, as educated as I like to be on all the different varieties of plants and how they interact with each other. So I found myself at the very beginning planting anything that I knew to be wild and in any way whatsoever endemic to New Mexico. Some of those didn't survive because they didn't have the right amount of sun, or they didn't have the exact pH they needed, didn't have the right amount of shade in a given day, the right amount of moisture, and the right amount of other species of plants that interact with them in various alliances and make life possible. So some beautiful plants, such as horehound, quickly overproduced, and we were too successful in relationship to the very sensitive and often rare and threatened species of plants that existed there with it. And so by reintroducing that, I saw that I was having what, even though it was well-meaning, I was having a negative impact, and we had to painfully restrain that proliferation in ways that appeared to bring it back into balance in our clumsy ways. So for me, a geography of relationship, and it's a geography of hope, in that by recognizing your place, that you can have an effective, affective place within that, and that we do have impacts even when we don't notice them, good and bad. And that recognition became so deep, it wasn't intellectual, it was at a level that people often call spiritual, sometimes magical, sometimes write it off as just emotional. But it was certainly more than a cognitive understanding. It was a re-emplacement. And I really loved the word that you used just a little while ago about in the entanglement of the wild, because it's not an easy thing. It's not something that we readily understand at this point in our life. We've been separate for so long. But yet it is actually a tangle. It's obstacles, it's mistakes, it's paying the price of being a responsible being that's willing to give up certain personal ambitions for the land or for your life for some vision of a greater, larger benefit to the whole. And so I think that transition comes with the first opening of our eyes. We see where we are, which is what geography is all about. We recognize what parts of ourselves are engaged. If you could hook up sensors to our entire being, the way they often hook up sensors to the brain now to read impulses under certain stimulus, you would see our entire beings being affected by, even when we don't know it, every tiny shift in terrain, every potential threat that we see, the shapes of the clouds and what we see in them, and the joy that can so often bring to us. These all speak as much of place as they do of process. Without place, none of this can happen. Without recognition of the places where we live, we're missing out on the joy and on the ways in which we can have an impact and truly make a difference.
Mm-hmm. I appreciated hearing you running the cows off and trying to reinstate native species to that area, and knowing that it's not always going to be exactly the right thing to do at times. And I've definitely found that with my own re-entanglement into the wild, that it's really hard to learn how to be in relationship again without making mistakes. And maybe that's not even possible. And how do we find that deeper trust and faith that we just need to keep coming back, and coming back with integrity, with responsibility, with accountability to the land and to that place? It's a really deep question. And I know not everybody also has access to doing that. And so it's a even more complex question to be asking in this time. And for those of us who do have access, then I feel like we even have a greater responsibility to the land and to the place, to the original peoples, to the plants, and so on and so forth. And so I've been getting a lot of visuals as you're speaking about the place that you steward. And I want to say too that within this conversation, I'm reminded of the importance of deconstructing the strategy of separation and the the deep-seated mistrust in our ability to survive and thrive without global capitalism. And at the same time, it feels important to voice that many ecosystems that are struggling to produce and sustain life, as communities around the globe are experiencing ecological breakdown, and with it, the strangling of traditional lifeways. The collapse of ancient salmon runs in Alaska comes to mind, and this is something that I'm just very deeply connected to, and physically and otherwise. And I'm wondering, how can we hold the assignment of bioregionalism with these communities and places in mind, where the land has been so thoroughly gutted by the ravages of industrial development or climate chaos? So if you could speak to the value of rewilding in these times of extreme ecological distress.
Rewilding, as I conceived it when I coined it, and the way I still feel about it now, is a very much a two-part process. One is that we try to understand what the most vital, healthy situation is for the natural world. And in that situation, it will be wild. It's inevitable. You just can't you can grow endangered species in a garden, but that's not the same thing as reestablishing or protecting existing wildness. And wildness is a quality that tribal peoples from all over the world, not just this continent, have almost inevitably held at the core of their beliefs, their religious beliefs, and how they lived. In fact, if they did not follow those priorities and concerns, the taboos that prevented one from overfishing a spot because the tribe gets too large, when you need to migrate because your horses or the buffalo that you're following have knocked down an area too much and you need to move them to another area, to a fresh pasturage. I mean, these kinds of interactions have existed forever in ways that were not just practical, but also integrated into the spirit of their beliefs and the spirit of their relationship. So some of the first activism that I did was working with First Nations peoples at Yellow Thunder Camp, and also, well, numerous places. But I'm thinking that where I moved to, the native peoples had already left over 900 years ago. When I went around to try to find as much information as I could about the ruins and the sacred paintings that are on the walls and all the things that I felt were trying to inform me through humans, not just through the plants and the animals. And very few of them could tell me anything. I went on a long search looking for the elders that were still informed, not just about their own traditions, but about what it was like in the area where I live now, because I've inherited a sacred trust to protect the artwork and the artifacts as much as the plant life and the animal life that's there. But how to begin when there is no existing human memory of what a place was like? So what would it look like if it was healthy and in balance again? We don't even know that. What prayers are most appropriate, not just to the larger mother, but rather to the spirits of that particular area, which they're different. It's just like going from party to party in the city. It's different clusters of personalities and of beings, none of whom can be approached in the same way. The words don't mean the same thing from one person to the next. And so we come to a place where we don't know how was it and what can it be again. But what we do have is the second aspect worked out completely, and that is rewilding of the South. Because there's nothing that we can do for any reason, economic or cultural sensitivity or anything like that, in terms of protecting nature, that can last if there's not a shift in human consciousness and awareness, a very wild reclaiming of what it means to be a human being, for us to basically be willing to suffer the loss of certain convenience and certain aspects of the technological society in order to be re-engaged and re-informed, to be so open, to be so free of our own dogma and fears that we can actually hear what the land is speaking to us, just as it did to our ancient ancestors in North America, in the Ukraine, in Australia. It matters not the where of it, or I should say that it's just as important everywhere, that there be a re-emergence and a re-entanglement based on the sensibility that's more about a passion, a spiritual feeling, a setting aside of our constant wordage and constantly thinking we know what's best, and listening, and then following what that says to us. Now, if we have that, even if we are to fail in our actual environmental activism, even if we can't protect a particular forest, it still gets clear cut. Even if there's a species, and so many species are being lost now that I don't want to get off on that subject, like causing such great depression. And yet, if even with all these extinctions, if we have in the moment accepted our wildness, reclaimed our connection to, and empowered ourselves to act upon the world that we know to be enlivened and sacred. That's what all peoples have always known. And it is not just the way to do things, but it is the reward. It's the way that we can feel a passion, and that passion will drive us to many great successes. Maybe not winning, per se, the environmental struggle, but saving a single plant, saving a single species, a single forest, no, even saving a single tree or plant becomes this amazing, incredible thing. And people do not have to imagine that they need to live in the wilderness for this to be relevant or for them to have any positive impact on it. Nor do they have to just depend upon donations or whatever in order to feel involved. It can start right wherever we are. When we talk about the rewilding, then that's a regreening of the cities. That's included in it. When we talk about having gardens, growing up the sides of buildings and reclaiming the roofs as garden areas for the people's benefit, for their connection as well as for the plants, and then to freshen the air. But it can start and has to start wherever we are, right in that place. And it may not be a wilderness where we have to wade in waist deep river to get home after an interview. It can just be the place where your eyes were open and your heart was open. And it feels so good to do anything to help that, to celebrate it, to celebrate the beauty, to help protect it, to care about it. That becomes the way in which everything for us is full. We can be content in knowing that we wouldn't have to think about it, that we are a part of it. We are the earth defending herself, not something acting upon it.
Hey For the Wild community, Ayana here. As appreciative as we are of the sponsorships we receive throughout the year, we can't continue to produce the podcast on their generosity alone. I know I've mentioned this before, but I just want to take a moment to express how much time, effort, and care goes into the preparation and production of our episodes. From research, writing, production, outreach, and social media content. With the format that we work in and other forms of emerging digital media in general, it's hard to demonstrate just how much work goes into the product that listeners have come to expect. Over the years, For the Wild has grown into a small, dedicated, and loving team of individuals who are committed to the work that we do. We all consider ourselves lucky to be able to do this work amongst each other and create unique offerings each week. However, For the Wild also wants to make sure that we're able to pay a living wage and support individuals in living a dignified life. As it stands right now, the funds we raise through our Patreon only cover the cost of 1 out of the 4 to 5 episodes we produce a month. If you want to see us continue, or perhaps are especially moved by the episode you are listening to today, please become a monthly sustaining member through our Patreon, or consider making a one-time donation directly to us through our website. You can do so at patreon.com/forthewild, or by visiting our website at forthewild.world/donate. All right, thanks so much for listening. Now let's get back to the interview. I loved hearing you speak to the celebration of beauty and life. And I've noticed in myself the overwhelm of the Anthropocene and the extinction crisis and just the challenges of rewilding physical places and whether or not we have knowledge of what they were before colonization, we don't really understand fully what's going to happen in the next couple hundred years with climate change. So it's extremely difficult to know how to move forward with restoration and rewilding in that way. But when you speak about the celebration, it brings me back into gratitude. And that is something that I've really been working with through the overwhelm and just the sheer paralysis I feel at times with what we're up against. But this morning I was lying in bed and before this interview, and I just was trying to be in the celebration of being and life. And that brings such a clarity to our relationships with the earth and beyond. And so I really resonated with that. And I'd now like to transition this conversation and discuss some of your teachings around herbalism, which, if I may quickly add, weaves so beautifully with the writings of your partner, skilled folk herbalist and word alchemist Kiva Rose. You both write about working with plants as a portal into the green world and a conduit for reconnection. In The Enchanted Healer, Kiva writes, quote, "The plants speak to us from every direction, through the air we breathe, in the taste of the food we eat, through the scent of a spring breeze. In their wild melody is the wisdom and healing of every age and place. Whether we choose to listen, to participate in the ancient dance, is completely up to us." End quote. So, yeah, it's so beautiful. And I'm really wanting to know, how can developing an herbal practice, or simply just working in concert with plants, their smells, their fabulous forms, motions, textures, energies, how can that wave us into ancient and new relationships with each other and the natural world? And perhaps you could share an herbal ally that you've held close in your personal journey.
Well, I first got involved with herbalism not because it was something I'd always thought I was going to do, but just I was at the point where I couldn't tour all year long doing medicine shows and followed up by demonstrations and police harassment and all the other exciting things that were a part of that, sleeping on people's couches and spending way too much time burning fossil fuels and driving around. And I came back home with a sense that somehow we had to integrate the healing of the personal self with the healing of the earth. And what heals the self best, perhaps, and I'm not just talking emotional or psychology here, but in terms of our actual bodies even, what reconnects us best is the actual plants, which have developed these chemicals that can serve almost in every situation. There's hardly any condition where a plant cannot, the actions of a plant, the chemistry of a plant, cannot have a positive impact, even if not a complete cure of it. And it does so almost always, or most often, I should say, without side effects, unlike pharmaceuticals from the technological paradigm, which so often destroys at the same time that they're working to alleviate a particular condition. And everybody I met involved with medical herbalism in particular, they reminded me, and this is just as true of the crazy ass botanists that I've met and stuff that are down there crawling around on their knees to name a new plant they haven't ever seen before. The teachers that are trying to pass on to their young students something about the joys of having a garden and eating locally grown food and healthy food, and or an artist who, through the manifestation, through the imagery of a plant, doesn't just tell us something about the plant, but tells us something about what it means to be fully alive, what beauty really means, how things unfold one into the other. And that all becomes so alive in that moment.
I, in so many ways, was brought into this movement by herbalism. Well, Occupy was definitely the spark. It was the fire starter, so to speak. Before then, I was definitely into radical literature here and there, but I wasn't as engaged until Occupy. But that was more of a political, intellectual connection. It wasn't an earth connection for me. And it wasn't until I moved out to Oregon and I was dealing with some health issues, and there was the Natural College of Natural Medicine, and there was the Portland Herbal Day or Portland Herbal Conference. It was a one-day event, and Cascade Anderson Geller was speaking, and she was so full of life, and she was animating these conversations with plants as she was speaking to us. And I'd never seen anybody talk about plants like that or tell stories about how she was speaking to plants. And she was also talking about activism at the same time and stopping resource extraction projects in the Mount Hood area. And it really wasn't until that moment that I met Cascade and opened up to herbalism that an entire world, like it was a portal opening into this way of relating to the land, where instead of going on a hike, which I think before that's what I would do, I'd probably go on a hike and I'd want to get on the trail and get to the end of the trail. And then I'd get back in my car, go wherever I was going. Through herbalism, it really taught me to engage with the land in such a different way, not only because I was trying to harvest medicine, but to slow down, to stop and actually be, rather than just try to get through it for some other exterior desire or reason or motive. It wasn't about that. It was about actually getting to know a place, getting to know the plants as people in their own right. And that completely changed my activism. And when I took the teachings of herbalism and the mentorship of Cascade, who has since passed, and combined that with the political rigor and passion of Occupy, it was like this perfect storm for me at the beginning, well, near the beginning of my own journey. And so I really appreciate that that's been a part of your journey as well. And I definitely feel a certain energy coming from plant folks. And
That's what's kept me doing it for so long. I can't believe we've been doing this annual event, the Good Medicine Confluence, for 11 years now. It was planned to be a one-time situation, but the people that came, and they weren't just, I don't think that they were typical herbalists overall. They were perhaps the most impassioned, most sensitive, most hurt, most caring, most capable of joy. They were absolutely in love with the plants. And that's so touching. And so to hear them say at last, here's an umbrella for this fusing of my deep, deep passion, the sense of magic and folklore and all the things that connect me to the plant story becomes my story. And thank you so much. Please don't ever stop. And that made it awfully hard because they were some of the most sensitive people. They are some of the most sensitive and caring human beings that I interact with. And that's after so many decades of working with so many different so-called radical groups in different fields of science and exploration. But all scientists seem to have a sense of curiosity. I shouldn't say all. The non-corporate scientists have a sense of curiosity that's almost childlike. And every single person that comes to our gathering, and I imagine all the people that read our publications, at least the majority of them, they're coming to it as two things: as a lover, really, engaging things as you would a lover, refusing to see that lover compromised or hurt or damaged or disrespected, and wanting to give it room to grow and blossom and be itself without control. And the other part is they come to it like children. I mean, they might have practiced for 30 years helping all kinds of people with some really serious conditions, but instead of ending up hardened, they're still making little squeaking noises when they find a certain plant that's working to be helpful to their client. They're running around outside, either in the wild places, wildcrafting, or in their gardens. They can't even open a bag from Mountain Rose Herbs without being overcome with first the smell and the sight and the texture and this physical engagement with the actual plant that can sometimes stop them in their tracks, and it might be a long length of time before they can get back to their tasks, because indeed they're inebriated, they are enchanted, and bless them for that. They have shown, and I hope will continue to show, that herbs are not just a way of treating ourselves outside of the harmful medical system, but they are indeed a portal and an opening. And Kiva describes it in her own terms of her own life as it gave her back her life. It was the way that she healed her entire being, not just healed certain things, certain conditions. And that's, I think, the real joy of this, is to see not just a combining of activism, love, concern, nature, social change, to see how these all come together around a plant that to other people may seem so quiet, may seem silent or mute, It may move so slow that we just think it's a piece of fixture of the scenery rather than this active communicating being that is indeed a relative to us, a part of us, and can help define us. It can bring us back to who we are. And that may be the most crucial thing about herbalism of all.
Mm. So beautifully said. I very personally resonate with that. And I wanted to mention that one thing that I really appreciate it in your writing is the way you offer so much space and patience and humble reflection around what it means to be an herbalist. And I'm sure we have a diverse audience of folks listening in today, from those well seasoned in the trade of botanical healing to those interested in developing deeper relationships with plants. So, with this in mind, I'm wondering if you could share more about the practice, culture, and art of folk herbalism, and as leaders within the movement, facilitating grassroots gathering and intellectual communing. How do you and Kiva feed the groundwater of blossoming folk herbalism resistance or renaissance?
it's, it's both.
Both. I was just about to say that. I'm like, actually, both make sense.
It is definitely just being an herbalist, just taking herbs. And I mean, before we even get into terms like what is our role, are we actually an herbalist or not? Just the moment that we even recognize the value of the plants, that is already a resistance. And if we buy from small producers that are doing high quality medicines, and then we're also taking a step further because we're resisting the commercialization and basically the appropriation of plants for corporate greed. It's kind of amazing the degree to which it really is a revolution as well as a reemergence into what it really means to be a human being. And folk herbalism, it's important to, folk too often has a negative connotation for people in terms of superstition. They almost equate it with superstition. It's what the common people did before there was science and they knew better. But that's really not what folk herbalism is about at all. It is first and foremost an empowerment, because it says that knowledge of healing, knowledge of anything for that matter, but in this case, knowledge about what plants to use, how to take care of ourselves, our families, our communities, the barrios, the ghettos, the small rural towns where there are no doctors. But we have that effect and that impact that's just huge.
Mm-hmm. And when considering the ancient tradition of herbalism, I think about the ways that herbalists and medicine makers, craftsfolks, and in particular indigenous healers have been marginalized and violently targeted throughout history. And taking us deeper into this idea, Kiva writes, quote, "To be an herbalist, especially in this era and place, is to walk the edge. These edges are important, imperative even. As herbalists, we're pushing at the borders of what's considered normal, sensible, and sometimes even acceptable within mainstream society," end quote. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about walking this edge, and more specifically, the importance of maintaining radical creative spaces for deep liberatory work outside of the system of licensure and paradigm of the quote expert. In the war against the wild, might decriminalization be a better path than deregulation when it comes to herbalism?
Well, there's not a huge amount of regulation yet, but it's fast developing. And it started it by attacking people who are making medicine in small batches in their home without the kinds of so-called approvals and verifications that they require. And it's at the behest of the pharmaceutical industry that the FDA in particular is having a ever escalating war against both herbalists and naturopaths who dare, and they've used that term, who dare take their own fates into their hands. So what has been the sidelining of indigenous healers is also now includes the sidelining of people who choose to take their own health and the health of their community, take responsibility for that themselves. And it's, that I think that's where the edge exists. It exists in a lot of places. It exists when we discover new information and we have to set aside what we've learned previously from books or whatever, assumptions that we have, long held assumptions. That's the edge too, because we're willing to try new things. Kiva's most amazing herbalism, to my mind, has been her discovery of uses for common plants that are not common uses, that have perhaps never been tried before in contemporary history, at least. And it's the edge whenever we dare to say that we're going to ensure, to the degree possible, the health of our community, of our people, of those that living with us, bioregional cultures. That's so important. And the edge is also where we risk. They might say that you're not allowed to any longer make that in your home, and you go to your kitchen as a, maybe a mother of four, and you say, nobody's going to tell me what the hell to do, and you make, to the best of your ability, medicine that's of benefit to you and the people you care about beyond your family. And so this edge is a place of the edge of knowing, of our certainty. It's the edge where we fall off of our rational platform into this, wild place, into this brush and flowers and wild things scurrying all about, and become informed by those things. We're constantly either leaping off or falling off, or both, from what's considered to be the reasonable, normal paradigm. And as soon as we do, that's where the adventure happens. That's where we see new places, or see things that we've always known with new eyes. Once again, they become something new to us, something we've seen all of our life. A rock, a hill, the sound of a child's laughter suddenly becomes so significant again. That's the edge of discovery, the edge where there's risk, the edge where we dare to be ourselves at all costs. And that's the place of discovery. It's also the place of coming home. And coming home is the only chance that humans have, not just plants and wildlife, but it's the only chance we humans have, is that we too can come home. And that will be coming home to a place that provides. There were monkey herbalists that they now know were gathering certain plants for certain specific ailments that they had, and using them over and over again, so that it was an ape cultural understanding rather than just an individual discovery. And so the edge really is the place where we fall back into what we were always best at, which is doing all we can with amazement, with love, with all of our efforts, with no certainty of success, and with every hope for an outcome.
I really love thinking about this edge work, and I do think that the edge is where we will probably be most fruitful and diverse, and pushing the boundaries, even thinking about ecotones and how the edges, say, between a forest and a meadow is where you're going to, see the most diversity in plants. And when I think about the regulation or, potential legal frameworks around herbalism, it really worries me. And I know this has been a big conversation in the herbal community for a while. And every time I've seen the government come in to quote unquote regulate something, what I usually see is a type of money grab. It's a way for big corporations to really deregulate what they want to deregulate. And then the small time mom and pop shops or small family operations will go out of business because potentially they can't pay for the type of standards that these regulatory agencies are placing on them. And it's a way to kick out the people on the edge. It's a way to imprison the edge itself. And it's a way to stop those discoveries from happening or spreading. And I know it's a heated debate at times, but even looking at what has happened to the cannabis, I don't even want to call it industry, but it certainly is now in California. So many people had thought that, especially the folks in cities, had thought that legalizing cannabis would be really good. It would help people stay out of jail. It would help the farmers. When I thought, gosh, let's just decriminalize it. But once we created this type of industry, I saw so many folks up in my neck of the woods really suffer from the strict regulatory agencies that came down on their farms. And so I just think about that in herbalism, and it would be really I would think crushing to see the wildness and the magic of herbalism being put into some type of stranglehold that some government agency is going to be the overlords of. So I know it's been something that's, every time I go to an herbal conference, it's definitely something that's been brought up, and I know that there's good opinions for the other side of it as well. But yeah, that's just what I've been feeling into.
Well, the edge, working with the government is not where the edge is. I guess we could put it mildly. There's so many unforeseen negative effects, regardless of even when they have the best of intentions. And of course, I think most of the time they do not. Most of the time they're serving their corporate masters. But where I find it empowering, not just empowering, but encouraging, is knowing that they simply cannot crush it. There's certain aspects of human spirit, a wild spirit in every species, that is not crushable. You can extinct a species, but you cannot take away its spirit, its insistence upon being itself in the face of all kinds of adversity. You put it in a zoo, you can dress it up in a Halloween costume for your selfies at Halloween time, but you cannot take away the actual elements of what it means for it to be a real wild creature. Herbalism is like that wild creature. It is like a wild species. It is the only way it's possible to be destroyed would be for us to have put an end to humanity itself. For as long as there are people, there will be some who care so much about plants and so much about helping people that they will, and I say once again, in our clumsy ways, because cultural sensitivity, ecological understanding, all those things are just now being developed by us. But we don't wait to act. We act on what our heart tells us matters the most. And what could matter most than that? When we did our first Good Medicine Confluence, we were told that there wasn't enough herbal gatherings, number one, and there wasn't. There's probably 30, 40 times more now than what there was 11 years ago. But they also said to focus on the kinds of skills that would make a person more accredited in the eyes of the dominant paradigm and the normies of the government, whatever. And that isn't where the edge is either. So even though plants and herbalism in and of themselves are intrinsically revolutionary and reconnective and spiritual, and yet the gatherings were, if anything, trying to give people more of a sense, in the same way that there are certain groups that put out letters, they hand out letters, like any corporate business or corporate field, to supposedly guarantee the quality of the herbalism of the practitioner. It doesn't guarantee the quality, of course. It only guarantees that they met requirements, not that they have intuition or an emotional or spiritual involvement. It only guarantees that they could pass a test at a particular time to do a certain amount of hours of something. So this idea of accreditation seemed to us to be somewhat antithetical to it and making it harder for the kinds of revolutions that we're talking about, this reconnection that we're talking about. And at that time, there was no audible, no visible melding of social justice and environmental justice, as insane as that sounds to me now. It was herbs where we fix our owies, and then there was, a revolution happening in society in terms of politics, how we treat each other. But those things are connected. They cannot be disconnected. We cannot wonder or worry about and help just other human beings, no matter how much they deserve it, no matter how long they've been in a particular place. That's part of it. That's an integral piece of it. Just as integral as that the air that they need to breathe, that the air that we need to breathe, that the soil, that the kinds of foods and plants that we're eating are not so genetically manipulated and poisoned that they're harming the very species. And so we tried to create a gathering that was where all of the herbalists, and these are folk herbalists, all the people who feel their connection is personal, that the credit that they need is based on their experience and the results that they get helping people. An umbrella, a tent, a place, a gathering, a fair, a place of celebration, a place of exchanging ideas and forming alliances and businesses and campaigns to change things, a place where that could come alive, where the consideration wasn't, do I have letters after my name? How much college have I done on this subject? What official organization has approved of me? But rather, how can I do anything but this? How could I not love plants this much? How could I not care this much for these communities and do this work? And that's the kind of people we've attracted. Over and over again, I've heard from them that I didn't feel I had a place in herbalism. I wasn't sure I was even an herbalist and that I deserved the term herbalist, that I didn't know enough about enough plants. But then you've helped me see that just knowing 3 or 4 plants really well and not just superficially, and paying really close attention to the effect it has on people of different constitutions and different situations, that is my work, that cannot be taken from me, that I will do that regardless of accreditation, regardless of approval, even if the income is way lower than what I would have made doing anything else. This is what I have to do, and more importantly, this is what I have to be.
Waking up and shifting. I am thinking back to the beginning of our conversation and even reading your bio, and that you have for a long time been pushing up against the machine of capitalism and resource extraction and this type of just what we know as dominant culture. And I know you were involved in direct action type of experiences, and I'm really interested to hear what your thoughts are at this point, seeing how the movements have shifted and grown and where we're at now ecologically, politically, socially. Do you think that nonviolent direct action is still a powerful way to make change? And if so, I'm just interested to hear what you envision if you could imagine audience members really wanting to step up their game, so to speak, and really start to get brave and courageous. Yeah, I would just like to hear your analysis from the time before and the time now, and where you've seen things going and what you think is still potent at this point.
My sense of that is constantly shifting, and culture is shifting so fast now that certainly my opinions have had to change accordingly. I began as a teenager really getting beat up in Griffith Park over an anti-war rally against the Vietnam War. It did seem to me that direct action, not just by the people that cared most, but direct action by people who would normally not be associated with anything radical, was probably an important signifier and factor in the ending of that war. A large part of it, of course, I know now from having read a lot of history, a lot of that was political and economic and was not directly related to actions. Does that mean that we shouldn't have put our bodies on the line to try to stop the attempted destruction of the Vietnamese people and their culture, to try to stop seeing our friends coming back, fellow 18-year-olds coming back in body bags again and again until they had to pass a special law that you can't take pictures of the coffins, right, as they land back in the States. But does that mean we shouldn't have acted? Of course not. We should act regardless of the effects while looking for that which is most effectual that we can possibly do for that purpose, for those aims. I really like the story of whether it's apocryphal or not, of Crazy Horse, the warrior, and how at one point him and some friends were riding upon a scene of some other people from their tribe being surrounded by and attacked by a large group of militiamen, I believe it was, rather than regular cavalry. And the point came up raised by one of the other warriors of, I don't think we have a chance, they can't pull this off. And basically, what has chance got to do with it? It's like you act because it's the right thing to do. And in that moment, it felt like the right thing to do, to ride in there grossly outnumbered and to see what can happen as a result. That could have ended up in complete failure and his own death. Instead, they scattered much larger forces with their yelling and shooting and just the vigor of the passion of what they were standing for. And that's important. It's crucial. And if we are to have what will be a miracle of returning to a society which is the least bit equitable in terms of how it treats other human beings, let alone treats Earth with enough value and our climate as having enough value to where it's not all about just one species. If that's to happen, and we have to do it in spite of the odds, not because of them, we have to do it whether we are aware of how powerful that particular action will be or not. I was listening to Mitt Romney today about being the one Republican who wasn't voting for impeachment. I thought, well, regardless of what my politics would ever be, I would have to respect that he did it not thinking that it was going to make the difference in terms of the vote on impeachment. He did it because it was the right thing to do. I may not agree with what's the right thing, but what else can we act upon, and how can we ever be content and satisfied with ourselves without that? That there will ever be more suicides, more quiet desperation, as Floyd Westerman used to sing, if we don't just act upon what we know to be important, what we know to be true, regardless of results, and sometimes even if it's not the best way to act. Now, since the Vietnam War, there was a huge revival beginning with Earth Day in 1970, which first involved me with environmentalism, that the environment is something which all human beings and all of life requires: a healthy ecology, a healthy interaction of nutrients and spirits of life forms, a diversity in human and non-human species, and how crucial that is. And at that time, it appeared to me that it was going to be integrated as a important part of a well-to-do society, that if we were going to be financially, in terms of lifestyle and a standard of living, if that was to be increased, it was to also include not just us, but to include other things which we have an impact on and can help. Since then, I've seen a lot of setbacks. The radical environmental movement, which I was involved with, really became scapegoated by the government. There was massive arrests, huge amounts of internecine conflict, that is, internal conflict between people that are allies, which is one of the most destructive factors, far more destructive throughout history than anything that the rulers could do, is what we do to ourselves. And I've seen wilderness being sidelined as something that's elite in simply the construction of rich white folks who are able to enjoy it. I've seen the whole idea of ecology as being something which, if you gave it too much attention now, that you weren't giving enough of your energy and support to either the reclamation, or extraction of resources to make human lives better, or you're somehow failing the disenfranchised people by considering the environment that they too will need in order to live. That's a very sad thing for me. And now we have technology involved that makes extreme direct action very risky physically, can easily result. We're in a kind of a surveillance state that makes that kind of activism very, very difficult. And so what I recommend to people now when people ask me is not which strategy do we do, but first of all, make sure that you've connected with your heart and with the earth in a way that, and the other peoples on the earth, in a way that informs your decision about what matters most. then to find out what your skills and abilities are, your true deepest abilities, whether it's empathy, writing, whether it's organizing direct actions, whatever it is, making phone calls, teaching kids. It just doesn't really matter what it is, but that it be your personal gift, your personal ability and skill, that you apply that with all your heart, once again, regardless of what the results are. So that kind of advice means not you should be doing direct action or you should skip that now and move on to something else, but rather that we need to do all of it, whatever our heart is saying, but we need to do something and we need to do it now. If everybody acts on not just beliefs, but on their fervent connection and their fervent feelings, then we're going to see the results. We're going to see the evidence of what works and what doesn't. We're going to hopefully make the adjustments necessary. But even if not, by not just staying home and internalizing, feeling guilty, feeling like you're not doing enough for the environment, feeling like you're enjoying yourself, you don't have any right to because there are other groups that aren't enjoying themselves. It's endless how bad we can feel about ourselves when what we really need to be doing is feeling good about who we are, good about what we're capable of doing, and good that we're getting up off our asses and doing it.
Hmm. Yes, well, yes. It just brings me back to that gratitude that I think can really fuel us when we can feel grateful, when we can feel good about our relationship and how we show up to this time. We're going to be able to really make such a bigger impact than if we feel terrible all the time. And not to say that we shouldn't let the grief in, but I really appreciate that positive power that you're speaking to, because I definitely could use some of that right now, just feeling good and feeling good. And like that goodness can give us that empowerment that we so desperately need to actually make change and to get off of our asses and to engage and embrace this time and embrace who we can be within this movement. And so I really am taking that personally to my heart. And to wrap this conversation up as it's coming to a close, it's been so wonderful to connect with you. I've been thinking about this quote, this kind of phrase that I've read in your work that you've called an ecology of healing. And it's naming the importance of viewing health beyond the absence of illness or disturbance and instead orienting around, quote, a state of dynamic wholeness and active balance, the reclamation and reintegration of its native aspects and parts, end quote. And so I'm really wondering if you could share an illustration of what this looks like at Anima Sanctuary's Botanical and Wildlife Refuge, and how does our participation, whether through restoration or stewardship or active engagement, fit into this vision of elemental balance and the restoration of an ancient code of reciprocity?
Balance is absolutely dependent upon reciprocity. It's not static. And too often we think of it as a balance point where things stay the same. There's an equilibrium. There really is no equilibrium in the natural world. What there is a constant flux that it's like a scale moving one way, and then when it goes too far, it leans back the other direction. So it's constantly in change. It's constantly evolving in its larger purpose, but certainly in the moment, it's reacting to what's going on around it. It's acting according to its own nature and to the way it's been informed by the place where it lives. And so it seems like to me that that is perhaps next to awakeness and awareness. I would say that an active, dynamic devotion to balance is essential right now, and it's probably the most important that we can do. It's balance I'm seeking when I'm trying to find a community, a neighborhood of species that will best bring back the vitality to that gorgeous riparian canyon that we live in. That's what I'm looking for in humankind and my fellow people. When I look to see a glimmer of that, a glimmer of balance, a glimmer of recognition, time to mourn, time to celebrate, time to give all we have, and a time to watch it grow and bloom. I mean, that's a bit of a paraphrase of a biblical term, and yet it's probably, like I say, next to being aware and awake and conscious, is probably the next important thing, is that we're actively moving towards balance in our lives, and that we remember balance for the earth, for the nature, whether it's that wilderness preserve I live on, whether it's your garden, whether it's your neighborhood, your park, the areas, undeveloped areas nearest to you. That's what it most all requires, is balance, and it requires us recognize that we're a part of that, that which way we lean helps move that one direction or the other. To constantly leaning towards the good, the whole, and the beautiful. That's the place that's most rewarding. It's not just the right thing to do, it's where we're going to feel mighty damn good.
Mm. Well, that was a wonderful place to close this conversation. So, well, thank you for your commitment to this earth and to really being awake, and for guiding so many folks towards reconnection. It's necessary and it's beautiful work. And I hope one day to meet in real life somewhere out in the wild, whether that's in the forest or in the desert. I feel like it's coming.
Well, you're welcome to visit us in May in Durango when we do the Confluence. I would be very glad to host you. And any time that you're willing to chance wading in waist-deep water, I'd like you not just see, but to feel what the spirits of that place are saying, and to sense then in your heart, that the work that you're doing to reach out at great risk to yourself with no certainty, but with absolute commitment, is the most wondrous and wonderful thing that a human being can do, especially today. I thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of For the Wild podcast. This is production team member Carter Lou McElroy, and the music you heard today was from Wildlife Freeway. I'd like to thank our host and founder, Ayana Young, as well as the rest of our podcast production team, Aidan McRae, Andrew Storrs, Erica Ekram, Aaron Wise, Francesca Glassbell, Hannah Wilton, and Melanie Younger.